Hello, lovely people. I am your host, Jason Miles, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. You are new to the channel. Welcome. So glad to have you here. If you're a returning listener, subscriber. So good to have you back. If you don't know, there is a feature we have on Patreon called the Crisis Papers, a series of essays of tons of different kinds of topics. It is free to all patrons, and the magazine layout version is free to the Teenage Anarchist tier or above, wherever you are watching or listening to this show. There's a link in the description for you to check that out. How are you guys doing so far? How did you guys like the show yesterday? The on location in the middle of a firestorm show. Right? It was insane. I'll be talking more about what happened last night in the champagne room. That'll be an interesting conversation. I can't wait to see what some of you have to say about that. But tonight, right now, we're going to discuss mental illness and the book Footprints of Schizophrenia. Wherever you are watching or listening to this show, there are links in the description to the book. When discussing the massive housing crisis that increased by a record 18% in 2024, we often hear people talk about the large number of mentally ill people walking the streets. Many people go undiagnosed. Many are suffering from a complicated combination of mental disorders and sadly medicated with drugs. Well, in September of 2024, the FDA approved a drug for schizophrenia called Cobenfy. I'm saying that right? Cobenfy. We'll just call it Cobenfy for all intents and purposes. Cobenfy targets muscarinic receptors in the brain, which may indirectly impact dopamine. We love our quick fixes in the United States. But is Cobenfy a wonder drug that can help put an end to severe mental illness? Today we'll be discussing the book, again, wherever you're watching or listening to the show, there's links in the description. Footprints of Schizophrenia, the evolutionary roots of mental illness, with our guest today, Dr. Stephen Lesk. This groundbreaking work unravels the ties between humanity's evolutionary history and the emergence of complex mental health conditions, from the primitive roots of consciousness to the modern challenges of disorders like schizophrenia and dementia. Dr. Lesk paints a compelling picture of the mind's evolution. Join us as we examine the key ideas from this very fascinating book. Please welcome Dr. Stephen Lesk.
All right. Thank you very much. I look forward to discussing my theories and viewpoints.
Well, thank you for taking the time to talk to me.
Absolutely.
I do think we probably need to get some definitions for some of the terms that we're going to discuss here that we'll be using on the show. What is dopamine? How does it work? And why does it need to be blocked in schizophrenic patients? And how would you define schizophrenia?
Well, those are several questions. I'll start with the dopamine. Dopamine is what we call a neurotransmitter. It bounces back and forth between neurons in the brain, and it's a reward chemical. It's a chemical that evolution used to encourage prehistoric people to engage in things like reproduction, finding food, anything that fostered survival and reproduction. But what happened 50,000 years ago is that we got language. And 50,000 years is a drop in the bucket. Hominins, or human-like animals, have been around for 6 or 7 million years. 50,000 is a drop in the bucket. I like to use the analogy, if you take 3 yardsticks, each one representing 2 million years, language has been around for less than the last inch. And language totally revolutionized how we use our brains. So this all ties together in the creation of mental illness and in some physical illnesses like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, Tourette's, restless legs, stuttering, things like that. So it's all interconnected and it's evolutionary based. We have to be looking at that.
And as far as the evolution of language, how does that alter the cognitive framework of early humans? And how does that shift relate to mental health changes?
Well, I may say some things that shock you or surprise you, but
Mhm.
let me start with this. Mental illness is entirely due to the evolutionary moment that we find ourselves in. 50,000 years ago, there was no mental illness. 20,000 years from now, there will be no mental illness as we define it. So, right now, because we're in this unique evolutionary moment, we're seeing mental illness. But if we wait 20,000 years, and not many of us will have that luxury, it will be gone because it's entirely due to this transformative change in how we use our brains
Mhm.
brought about by language, which is very recent, very, very recent. And not everyone's on board with it yet. Those who are least on board are the ones who have mental illness. I call them evolution's dispossessed. For 80% of the population, we cope fine with these changes, but there's still 20% that may get schizophrenia, bipolar, major depression, anxiety disorders, who are not processing dopamine in quite the best way that they should.
How would you, I guess, in your book, you talk about schizophrenics kind of being these people that didn't necessarily evolve. Um, so how would you describe it if you were trying to explain it to someone that didn't understand? Um, I think a lot of us understand schizophrenia as maybe a combination of a lot of different kind of disorders because not many of us actually went to school to figure this out, and many of us have been taught that schizophrenia has something to do with multiple personalities.
Yeah, that I would like to disagree with.
Sure.
Most people will tell you it has nothing to do with multiple personalities. Think about this.
Hmm.
You're going through high school,
Hmm.
you're doing okay, you have a group of friends, your grades are okay. Suddenly, around the age of 18, late high school, early college, everyone starts treating you differently, and you have no idea why. They treat you like you're incompetent, like you're saying crazy things, and you don't understand it. Now, to everyone else, you have changed greatly. And what they notice is that you've stopped caring about your appearance, you've
Hmm.
withdrawn from your friends and your family, and you started to say strange things like, the FBI is following me, or they're tapping into my cell phone and my computer, or I'm hearing voices from the vents. And what has happened is that the way you're thinking has regressed to the type of thinking that we had prior to language,
Hmm.
lost all that modern complexity. So now you're trying to cope through life with a much more primitive type of thought process. The thought process that kids have,
Hmm.
people who use psychedelics have, that we all have when we're sleeping, you are now stuck with permanently because of this desuppression of dopamine. So it's a chronic, persistent mental illness that has changed the way you think, the complexity of your thought process, and that's entirely due to the evolutionary moment that we're in.
Hmm. Interesting. Um, One of the questions on the screen: how does dopamine affect neurodivergence?
When you say neurodivergence, you mean,
Autism?
well, autism is also part of this. In other words, autistics,
Mhm.
very often you'll notice, are very bad at language. And the most severe autistics don't talk at all. So language may have a lot to do with autism as well. But what happened was 50,000 years ago, when we got language,
Mhm.
we learned to suppress dopamine and acetylcholine in areas of the brain that we never could before. And so, what we do when we learn language, and each of us does this as we grow up, starting from age 1 as kids, we learn language, and language delivers us to a much more realistic way of thinking. Freud called it the reality complex. We can now think realistically, and that involves a suppression of dopamine. But when schizophrenia starts, that suppression all unravels, and there's a huge surge of dopamine, bringing the person back to that less complex, more primitive way of thinking.
Can you hear me, doctor? Can you? Well, your computer froze for a second, so I didn't know if
Oh,
you
I'm sorry.
lost
Yeah, I can
contact
hear
with us.
you.
Okay, okay. Um, so in the book you do talk in the first part of the book you talk a lot about, well, actually throughout it, but in the first part of the book you talk a lot about the suppression of dopamine. This new medication, I guess it came out late last year, or the FDA approved it late last year. Am I saying it right? Cobenfy?
Cobenfy.
Cobenfy. What is your opinion on Cobenfy? Is this going to be a helpful medication, or are we looking at it kind of wrong as trying to medicate this way?
Well, it's too new to tell, just how effective it's going to be. It takes years to really get a sense of how a medication is doing. But I will say that even though in the long run it does the same thing as the older meds, it goes about it from an entirely different way.
Mhm,
So all the meds that we use for schizophrenia block dopamine. Why? Because they have this huge surge of dopamine. This medication doesn't block it, but it uses another chemical, acetylcholine, to suppress the dopamine. And what we're hoping is that it's going to have fewer side effects,
mhm,
great efficacy, and a good other option for schizophrenics. Psychiatry is in the dark ages. Our medications don't work well enough, and they are so full of side effects. These antipsychotic medications can cause permanent neurological damage in some cases, intense weight gain with type 2 diabetes, drooling, seizures, something called neuroleptic malignant syndrome, where you get very sweaty and stiff, and your kidney tests go way up. All of these things, and we don't know which medication is going to help which person. So there's a constant trial and error. So we're hoping that this will be an improvement, but the ultimate thing that it does is essentially the same as what the old meds do, but gets about it from an entirely different direction. But every mental illness we have has to do with the desuppression of dopamine, not just schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depression, anxiety disorder. It's all a desuppression of dopamine that comes back at us because some people aren't quite at the point that others are, in that they can suppress dopamine as they learn language. So we know what's causing this, but psychiatry is ignoring it. They refuse to look at evolution at all as a cause of mental illness whatsoever.
Why do you think that is?
I think that they are so fixed in their research protocols that they're like gophers. They're digging through a tunnel, and they just keep going and going, hoping they find an answer without ever sticking their heads up, to look, where are they?
Mhm.
Talking about something like mental illness without looking at evolution is like putting a bicycle together without the pedals. It may look good, but you're not going to get very far. And this geneticist named T. Dobzhansky said, nothing in biology can be understood except in the context of its evolution. And that is so true, but yet orthodox psychiatry refuses to look at it. They just duck their heads and don't want to have anything to do with it. So I'm kind of a lone wolf in this effort to get things to change. And what I'm hoping is that people with mental illness, bipolar, major depression, anxiety disorder, schizophrenia, go to their providers and ask them, what is the connection between evolution and mental illness? And if the answer is, I don't know, give them the book. First you read it, and you
Yeah.
give it to them. Because that's the only way this is going to change when they see that their patients are
Mhm.
demanding better answers. And that's why I wrote the book. I was not satisfied with the answers that we had to give our patients about mental illness.
'Cause you still work with, schizophrenic, bipolar
Well, I
patients.
just retired in February, but for 40 years, I worked with every diagnosis in adults, not
Mhm,
kids. And I've treated thousands of patients. I've
mhm,
mentored hundreds of students. I was the chairman of the Department of Psychiatry in the Brooklyn VA for a while and taught at the medical school, published a few papers. But
mhm,
this is different. I have to make a change in orthodox psychiatry's perception
mhm.
of what mental illness is. And that's not easy, but they have to start looking at evolution.
I mean, we're dealing with maybe the worst houselessness, homelessness, whatever ness you wanna put on there, crisis we've seen, right? There's an 18% uptick, I mentioned it in the opening of the show, and the majority of people that you're going to deal with if you work in services, I don't know what type of people you were working with. I worked for a time in homeless services before I came here to Mexico. So I'm not Dr. Jason. I was just the dude that was on the ground, right?
Right?
Um, and there was a lot of trauma that people experienced. I mean, losing your home is traumatic, right? Being ripped from your parents is traumatic. And there tons of people have that story, right? They got taken away as kids, grew up in foster care, then got thrown out because they aged out and maybe been on the street ever since. There's a lot of people like that. Is this trauma related?
Schizophrenia?
Mhm. Can
No,
be.
it's
No?
entirely due to evolution.
Okay.
Now, there are some things that increase your odds,
Mhm.
like if you're born in winter months, if you grow up in an urban area, if you have an elderly father, those increase your risk. If you have first degree relatives like parents, aunts, uncles, brother, sister, who
Mhm.
have schizophrenia, your risk increases. That doesn't mean it's a genetic illness or a trauma related illness. It's entirely due to the evolutionary moment that we're in. And I want to make that very clear. 20,000 years from now, there will be no mental illness. We're still in an adjustment phase. Now, homelessness is a complex issue.
Yes.
Some of it is due to schizophrenia. And one thing that schizophrenics have is called anosognosia. They're not aware that they have an illness. And it takes years and years of working with them to impress upon them that they do have a mental illness. So we're sitting in offices treating patients who don't understand that they're ill with medications that don't work well, that we don't understand, treating patients we don't fully understand. And I'm trying to change all that. If we could look at evolution's role in creating all this, stigma would go down. Now we understand what we're treating,
Mhm.
stigma would go down. Schizophrenia is 1% of the population worldwide. That's 3.5 million in this country alone. But do you
Mhm.
ever hear about schizophrenia? No, it's entirely under the radar. Why? Because there's so much stigma involved with schizophrenia and all mental illness.
Yeah.
People don't want to talk about it. But think of all the family members affected, the
Yes.
patients, the caregivers, everyone. We've got to start talking about this and bringing it out into the open now that we have an explanation for it. But psychiatry wants to go along with no real explanation. When families ask a psychiatrist, well, what is schizophrenia? You just said my daughter has schizophrenia. What is it? Well, it's a chemical imbalance. Or
Mhm.
they'll say, well, it's connectivity in the brain, or
Mhm.
it's genetics. These are catchphrases that don't mean anything. If
Mhm.
you read my book, you will see the real explanation for what schizophrenia and mental illness is and why we're seeing it at this point in evolution. And not just mental illness. As I said, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, Tourette's, all these are dopamine related illnesses. We have to look at this. And I believe if we can look at it, there's great optimism for change. We can change our research protocols. We can reduce stigma. We can make better medications. Maybe Cobenfy is going to be a big step up. Let's hope. It's too early to tell, but we'll have much better chance of doing all this if we really understand who the patients are that we're treating and why they have the illness.
Does it feel to you that part of the treatment, so to speak, is to kind of keep them, I don't want to say doped up, but subdued? And then it's like, okay, well, that problem is gone.
Not necessarily. The antipsychotics, they date back to 1955, and they were not developed for schizophrenia. They were developed, Thorazine was developed to be a medication that would calm you down before you went into surgery. And lo and behold, it's called serendipitous. They happen to notice that it takes away schizophrenic voices, delusions, agitated behavior, and suddenly they started using it for that. Within 10 years, 100,000 mental patients were discharged from what they used to call asylums. So it's not a question of doping them up. It's a question of actually reducing their symptoms with the medications, but they're not good enough. They have too many side effects. Some people don't benefit enough from them, and they lose functioning, and they may atrophy, have brain atrophy as well. So most of the time, if you're diagnosed schizophrenic, you're going to have to be on medication the rest of your life, and even with it, your functioning level will drop, and you may have to work in low-level jobs. You may live in a group home where they give you your meals. You may never marry. So it's a devastating disease, and we need to increase our understanding of it. And that's why I'm fighting as a lone wolf to get this message out. People have to realize what we're dealing with before we can conquer it.
How would you explain the evolutionary underpinnings of behavioral and psychological divergence in individuals?
Well, 50,000 years ago, we were animals. We were no different from any other animal. We weren't even at the top of the food chain. We would get up in the morning, run around looking for food if we could find it, with our spear and a little rock tied to the end of it, and hope we didn't get killed by a lion, pack of wild hyenas, a snake, a gorilla. We were animals. Now, once we got language, our thinking became much more reality based and much more complex. So, this recent evolutionary change that completely revolutionized how we use our minds is what led to the advances that we see now. It led to civilization, it led to education, science, all kinds of institutions, jurisprudence, you name it. And it led to civilizations. The whole point of civilization is to protect the individual from these predators. And at this point in our history, we've neutralized 99% of the predators that used to plague us as cave people.
Mm-hmm.
So all of this is so new that some people are still getting on board with it. And like I said, those least on board, I call evolution's dispossessed. Those are the mentally ill.
When you came up with this theory and you're writing this book, I'm sure you've been talking about this for a while because we don't just write a book instantly. These are things that we've been working on for some time, and you've had decades in the industry. How do your peers view this viewpoint?
Well, first of all, my peers haven't heard about it. I haven't gotten book sales yet. I don't know how many have sold,
Mm-hmm.
but I meet with, retired psychiatrists and other psychiatrists. They've never heard of this because orthodox psychiatry doesn't want some unknown psychiatrist telling them what mental illness is. That's a big blow to their ego, as it were. So, I don't get a lot of feedback from people that have read the book. They feel very good about it and they feel confident about it, but not enough are aware of it. That's what I'm trying to do. And that's why I want every patient who has a mental health provider to demand them to answer the question, what is the connection between evolution and mental illness? And if they don't know, get them the book, because we have to make a change in this. That's the only way things are going to get better.
How does modern medication reflect the interplay between evolutionary biology and mental health treatment?
Well, if you think about it, 50,000 years ago, there was no medication for anything.
Mhm.
So it wasn't until we got language and our brains became much more complex and scientific that we were able to even make a medication like Thorazine. So before that, there was no hope. Once we got language and we evolved into this complex, Homo sapien brain structure with reality testing and complexity of thought, that led to scientific discoveries, chemistry, the ability to synthesize chemicals and make things that actually reverse, in a sense, the evolutionary fallback that schizophrenics engage in. We're reversing it with a chemical. That is a miracle in itself. Of course, a lot of these things, as I said, we came upon accidentally, like antidepressants. They came about from medications that were being used for tuberculosis that
Mhm.
had some of the properties of antidepressants, and we uh, were able to extrapolate from that, what it was. So one could say that evolution gave birth to language, then civilization,
Mhm.
then science, and then all kinds of incredible inventions. I mean, just in my lifetime, when I was a kid, a television was this big box with this small black and white circle in it that flickered.
Mhm.
Now you have these flat screen TVs on the wall in living color. Everyone has a cell phone. Even when I was in college, computers were not big yet. There's been so much change so rapidly, all due to the fact that our thought structure is much more complex. And why? Because of language. Almost every anthropologist will tell you language is the key that did it. And once we got language, Homo sapiens wiped out all the other species of Homo, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, the Naledi. We wiped them out because they didn't get language the way we could. Neanderthals can't even make, or couldn't even make several sounds, maybe seven. We can make 26 or more sounds and have an alphabet that we can pronounce. So, this blessing of language has given us so much. We have to be able to look at it and see the role that it is playing in mental illness, and then we can move on. Psychiatry will come out of the dark ages. Do you know that there's not one laboratory test, x ray, or CAT scan that a psychiatrist has to make a diagnosis? Not one. Do you know any other specialty that's in that position? We would
Mhm.
love to have one, but we're in the dark ages and we don't yet. Someday we will. But first of all, we have to look at what role evolution played in the things that are affecting people so adversely right now.
Well, early on in the book, you do talk a lot about evolution in the first few chapters. How does the concept of entropy help explain the persistence of mental disorders in human populations?
Well, my second book that I'm trying to get published is totally about entropy. And think of it. If you think of the way a child talks, children use a different logic than we do. They have different rules of thinking. As they become adults, their thinking becomes more complex, more nuanced, and more, well, I guess complex is the best word for it. Now, entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, you could say is the same thing as disorder or chaos.
Mhm.
Entropy seeks disorder in all of us, and eventually all of us succumb to entropy. We die. But entropy also affects thinking. And when schizophrenics go from complex to primitive thinking, that gratifies entropy. You've gone from a complex, organized, energetic way of thought
Mhm.
to a more primitive, lackadaisical, childlike way of thought. And you can see this change in kids. If you ask a child, what is the moon? He'll say, oh, it's a big fat man who can eat you.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, they use different rules of logic just as primitive people did. But now we use complexity, and when we back off to more primitive thinking, that gratifies entropy. So, in that sense, entropy is gratified when people get mental illness or dementia or
Mhm.
anything else that denatures the complex energetic state of mind of most modern adults. It gratifies entropy.
Now we got to get into the part of the book that I was scared to look at. Not going to lie. My father has been diagnosed with dementia. It's been um, tough for a lot. It's been tough for him, as I don't think, to your point about these diagnoses, there was no scan involved. It was like a series of tests he had to take that he didn't pass. But maybe the most important question of the night. Oops. Okay, I'm trying to find it. For a lot of people, is this: in what ways does bipolar disorder reflect evolutionary adaptations gone awry?
Well, bipolar disorder is also a desuppression of dopamine. Every mental illness can be boiled down to the desuppression of dopamine. When we learn language, we learn to suppress dopamine in areas of the brain we never could before. But for some people, that goes awry and they desuppress dopamine. Now, you could say that bipolar disorder is an attempt to avoid depression or schizophrenia. What bipolars do is that they go into a state of mind that's animated and euphoric and with extreme confidence. They're
Yes.
so confident that nothing can affect them that they do all kinds of irrational things, like they'll spend their kids' college fund at a casino because they're so sure that they can't lose.
Hmm.
It's the opposite of depression, where people think they have loss of self-esteem and that they're worthless and things like that. And we treat the best way to treat bipolar mania is with medications that block dopamine. What do you know? Medications we use for depression indirectly block dopamine, and when they fail, we add the dopamine blockers. So every mental illness is due to this desuppression of dopamine. Fortunately, 80% of us process dopamine and suppress it correctly and effectively. But for that 20% that has one type of mental illness or another, it goes awry. And we have to add chemicals to try to fix it. But our chemicals could be so much better if we understood the connection between evolution and mental illness, evolution and dopamine. They're not looking at it. Their heads are in the sand and they wish to remain there.
How would you describe dementia as a byproduct of the human brain's complex evolution? What might disorders like Alzheimer's be considered evolutionary trade offs for cognitive advancement? Um, Also, how do you feel about some of the Alzheimer's and dementia medications out now?
Well, to answer that question, first of all, they're not good enough. Why? Because we don't understand what the illness is. If you take a look at Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, they're sister disorders. In Parkinson's, the dopamine producing cells die. In Alzheimer's, the acetylcholine producing cells die. Now, guess what? Dopamine and acetylcholine are seesaw chemicals. One goes up, the other goes down, and vice versa.
Mhm.
So, obviously, this has to do again with evolution. Anything related to dopamine has to do with evolution. So, when you see a patient with Alzheimer's,
Mhm.
and their acetylcholine cells are dying, and that's affecting their memory, their
Mhm.
thinking, and even physical welfare. It's because this whole new way of processing dopamine with language doesn't sit well with anyone, with everyone. With
Mhm.
most people, it does, but with 20% of us, it does not. And that is obviously involved in these dementing like illnesses like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. We have to look at that, and our medications will improve. Right now, they're a drop in the bucket. And believe me, I saw this. My wife had Alzheimer's. It
Sorry.
was so tragic to watch. They would give her the meds and they would help a little, but so very little. We have to gain a deeper understanding of what we're treating before we can come up with treatments for it. And I'm thinking of all kinds of treatments we could use with Alzheimer's. Helmets that are sensory stimulators, because we know that Alzheimer's patients lose hearing and they lose sense of smell. So we
Mhm.
could increase their sensory input with a helmet like virtual reality glasses and things. We could use AI and facial recognition to try to recognize Alzheimer's and Parkinson's earlier because there are facial changes that go with that. There's so many things we could be doing and we don't. There's so many barriers to getting things like this seen and heard and considered. It's sad. It's like there's a wall or a moat around the scientific community, and they don't want to be bothered. They don't want things to penetrate.
You know, in dealing, and I can only talk about my dad. And in dealing with the people that were homeless, they had such an array of problems. I don't know who was schizophrenic, who had Alzheimer's. They were also mostly elderly as well. So I'm sure there was some dementia sprinkled in there here and there because there's a lot of drug addiction and alcohol addiction. So I really don't reference that. I reference my own family dealings with this with my dad, which is a relatively new diagnosis just in the last few months. Um, his memory hasn't really gone. If I call him, you know, he knows who I am. He remembers my children, his grandchildren. Um, that's all fine. You know, I watched all the movies and I thought it was going to be like the movies, and it's definitely not. But his paranoia increased to a very confrontational level, um, where he had to be removed from his home because of his paranoia over a neighbor that didn't really exist. Um, I took several trips up to the Bay Area where I'm from, where he lived, to do extremely simple tasks that this man had done his whole life, like, you know, turn the football game on. You know, he's a huge football fan. I'm like, why aren't you watching the Niners? He's like, I can't find the game on TV. I'm like, what are you talking about? You can't find the game. This is before we knew, right? It was like these little cognitive things that had declined. And in reading your book, thinking about this primitive brain, it felt like he regressed to this primitive level. And it almost felt like he regressed to his younger. My dad was a little rough around the edges as a young man. So
Mm,
he kind of regressed to this thug dude. And that dude had been dead in him for decades. You know, he's grandpa. He had been grandpa for 2 decades, right, with me.
yeah,
And grandpa went back to being this, you know, angry at the world cat.
yeah.
Um, he's now that he's out of that situation, he's a little more calm. He doesn't talk as much, sadly. Um, is there really any getting better, or is there maintaining with these things?
Well, the medications we have aren't great, but you should know that the course of dementia and Alzheimer's is very variable. Some people go on for years and years, and other
Mm,
people only live, a few months. So it's hard to predict. But when people get paranoid like that, we can treat it. And what do we treat it with? Dopamine blockers. Why?
mm,
Because acetylcholine went down, dopamine went up. Whenever there's a rush of dopamine, You can get psychotic ideas, primitive thinking.
Yeah.
So there is medication that can help with paranoia when people have dementia, and depression. Certainly, it's good for demented people to be on antidepressants that can help uh, prolong their time before the Alzheimer's fully sets in.
Hmm.
So it's definitely worth taking him to a neurologist and or psychiatrist to work on these issues. But the bottom line is, they tend to progress, and we haven't figured out a way to keep those acetylcholine cells from dying. And until we do that, it's not going to go well for people. And if you look at evolution, it's clearly related to this change in how we process dopamine that came about with language very recently. And until we look at that, we're going to be misfiring and shooting in the dark. You can't cure an illness you don't understand.
Yeah.
And without looking at evolution, our understanding of it is limited and sometimes minimal at best. I'm sorry to say. I'm not disparaging psychiatry. I was a psychiatrist for 40 years and I helped an awful lot of people. But we could do so much better. Our medications could be so much better. Our treatments could be so much better. Instead of just hoping maybe research will help, we have to look at different things, be open to different opinions and viewpoints, even if you reject them. Consider them, and then things will change. And I'm optimistic that we can make an improvement in psychiatry and in our treatments for mental illness and dementias. I'm optimistic about it, but I'm fighting, this battle
Mhm.
in essence alone, and I need everybody's help who has a mental illness to ask their provider about it. What does evolution have to do with mental illness? And if they shrug, you give them this book and say, read it, because you got to know about this. And
Again,
that's how
wherever
it's going to change.
wherever you guys are watching or listening to the show, there's a link in the description to Dr. Lesk's book. Do you see that there's a more diagnoses of bipolar, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, and dementia? Are you seeing more and more diagnoses of that? And if so, why do you think that is? Is it because we can identify it better?
I don't think we're seeing more. I
Mhm.
think schizophrenia has always been 1% of the population worldwide, and it continues to be. One of the great paradoxes of schizophrenia is, well, why isn't it extinct? Darwin said that any illness that reduces your ability to function and reduces your ability to reproduce, and schizophrenics reproduce at a much lower rate than the average, will quickly go extinct. Why hasn't it gone extinct? Because it's not genetic, it's evolutionary. So we have to look at these things. Bipolar is maybe 1 to 2% of the population instead of just 1, and we're still diagnosing it at that rate. I think one reason we're seeing more dementia is that the population is aging, and the
Gotcha.
biggest risk factor for dementia is age. So that's a good part of it. So I think we're diagnosing pretty accurately, but we're not understanding well enough what we diagnose.
Hmm. So you're saying it's just because the largest population, the baby boomers, are
Yeah,
finally starting to age out into this age of
yeah.
Alzheimer's and dementia. And that's why we're seeing more.
Yeah, and we're seeing type 2 diabetes, we're seeing atrial fibrillation. They're what they call mismatch diseases, diseases that arise out of the mismatch between our current lifestyle and the lifestyle we evolved in.
Mhm.
Think of it, we were animals running around a jungle, eating berries and bark and roots, and occasionally we'd kill an animal and cook it. That's not the same as eating a cake that's full of fat, sugar, and carbs and no protein. That
Mhm.
our bodies are not used to that. You can't go to McDonald's and eat 1,000-calorie meal full of fat and carbs and
Mhm.
expect our bodies to handle it. It's a mismatch between our evolutionary environment and our current environment. And the current environment came about because we became civilized and because our brains are in much better complexity now than they were 50,000 years ago. We advanced, we got civilizations, we got science.
Mm.
But civilization doesn't always do us favors in everything it does.
So should
Including-
we every so often just slaughter an animal? Is that just
What do you mean?
should we just go for a random hunt every so often to get back to our
No,
'cause you're
I'm
saying that
saying that look at our diet compared to the diet of the caveman.
yeah.
They didn't slaughter that many animals. They ran around. If they could find a berry
Mhm.
patch, they would eat it. If they found an apple, a piece of rotting fruit, or pulling roots out of the ground, they would eat it. That's a far cry. And there are many periods of starvation. And I've told people there's nothing wrong with fasting for a day or two. Our bodies like that. They're used to it. We evolved in situations where we couldn't find food for days at a time. So there's nothing wrong with that. But the mismatch between that diet and our current diet is so great that we're seeing type 2 diabetes through the roof. We're seeing dementias. We're seeing heart disease, all kinds of things that are at least partially diet related.
So you're seeing a relationship between the modern diet and some of these disorders?
Well, certainly the physical ones like type 2 diabetes, heart disease, possibly dementias having to do with, higher fat diets. Um, these things, are mismatched and we need to look at them.
Mm,
Our pancreas, which ejects insulin so we can put glucose into our bloodstream, is not used to 1,000 calorie piece of cake. It just that's not always what was it was designed for. It was designed for people who ate barks and roots. So let's think about it for a moment and try to balance our lifestyle. Sedentariness. The caveman woke up in the morning and wherever he went, he got there on his own power.
mm.
Sedentariness is as bad as smoking or other carcinogens. I mean, so we have to be aware of that and put a little exercise into our daily routine so that we can decrease the mismatch a little bit.
As far as depression, how does that fit in the evolutionary role?
Every mental illness is due to the desuppression of dopamine. So when people get depressed, they're essentially adopting what the animal adopts when they go into hibernation in the winter. Their appetite decreases, their sleep is bad, their energy is bad, they don't have interest in sex, and this is due to a desuppression of dopamine. And when we give antidepressants, they trigger something called the autoreceptor that suppresses all the neurotransmitters, including dopamine. Now, it may not work well enough. Then we add the dopamine blocking meds, and they suppress dopamine, and that may pull us out of it. But every mental illness is due to the desuppression of dopamine that we learned to suppress 50,000 years ago with language, and that 80% of us do well. But that 20% with bipolar, major depression, anxiety disorders, OCD, and schizophrenia have
Mhm.
a problem with it. It is just too new.
And anxiety disorders, before you go, is that seeing a rise?
Well, I know I'm hearing a lot about depression and anxiety in youth. And
Mm,
I think it's possible that, the use of social media may contribute to that, the pandemic, the social distancing. So we're seeing that. Um, but by and large, there have been suicides and anxiety disorders and OCD, forever. So, at least since we got language 50,000 years ago. So that's not changed. Our awareness of some of these things have changed, and that contributes to it. But I do think it's possible that social media is causing more depression and anxiety in youth and suicides as well.
yeah. Do you think it has something to do with the fact that you're kind of always in the public eye in a way that we've never seen before?
Yeah, I think there can be public shaming for certain people, things like that. Now, during the pandemic, social media was a godsend
Yeah.
because kids who couldn't talk to their friends were at least able to talk to them through social media. So it's not so clear. It's a double-edged sword, but we are seeing that. And I'll give another explanation for why we're seeing a rise in anxiety, depression, and perhaps transgenderism. As we neutralized all these predators that the caveman had to deal with, evolutionarily, evolution is now in a sort of free fall. 90% or 95% of these predators are gone, and those fueled evolutionary change. If
Mhm.
you take those away, evolution is in a free fall. Gender roles are kind of getting blurred, and people are more anxious. They're not stepping into the usual roles of, familyhood,
Mhm.
parenthood, etc. And
Mhm.
that, I think, is part of why we're seeing these changes. Evolution has, in a sense, lost the winds in its sails because we've done such a great job in neutralizing predators. The biggest predator we have not neutralized is the Homo sapien.
How do we neutralize the Homo sapien?
How do we?
Mhm. Or should we?
We should. I think what that is going to take, when I write about entropy,
Mhm.
animals have learned to kill, eat, and hunt other animals. And that helps entropy. Entropy wants to turn organic matter back into the inorganic. Now, when we became civilized, this tendency to kill and eat animals had to be suppressed. Freud called it the death instinct. But in order for civilizations to work, you have to suppress that urge to kill animals and to kill others. And some people, obviously, who are dictators or whatever, aren't that great at it. And we've had endless wars, genocides, the war to end all wars didn't end them.
Mhm.
World War II, Vietnam, etc. There's almost always a war because this death instinct has such a strong pressure to be expressed that it comes out in horrible ways, mass murders, etc. But civilization was created to help us control that.
And it hasn't worked out yet. Or we're still evolving, is what you're saying.
Right. We're better than the caveman. If the caveman saw a woman, he just ran after her and had sex with her. There was no morality. So we're better than the caveman, but we're still not there, obviously.
Well, his name is Dr. Stephen Lesk. Wherever you're watching or listening to this show, Footprints of Schizophrenia is the name of the book. There's a link in the description. It's literally the first link in the description. You don't have to search for it in the description. It's right there
You
on
can
top.
get it at Amazon, Barnes and Noble, anywhere.
I think I put the Amazon link up. I think that's the one I put up. Do you want to say anything before you go? You want to plug
No, I
anything?
thank you for this opportunity. This is what I'm going to do is get this message out, and I hope patients will help me by asking their providers about it. Read the book. It's understandable. It's written for the average person. Um, and thank you for letting me expound on my theories.
I do want to say I was a little nervous when your PR person hit me up. I'm like, schizophrenia. I don't know if I want to talk about that. And then she actually sent the book right away. And then I got the book, and I'm not. I'm going to be honest with you again. Didn't. I was like, I don't. This is going to be full of medical jargon, and it's going to be super dense. And it wasn't.
Well,
It's actually easy to read. You joke in the book. Um, it's
humor
it.
gets us through.
Yes, yes. So it's a better read than you think. It's not a door stopper. I think it comes with clocks in like 240, 250 pages. So
Uh,
um, again, wherever you're watching, listening to the show, there's links in the description. Dr. Stephen, thank you so much,
Thank you so much.
and
Take
have a
care.
very good rest of your evening.
You too.
I did start a little early tonight, guys. I hope that didn't mess you guys up, but the doctor got in early. We were chatting a bit before the show, and I was like, you know what? It's late where you are. Let's just start the show early. It's on the internet. It's not like you can't rewind. Right? So there's that. My mom chimed in, so look at that. Who would have thunk it? I hope you guys dug the show. Again, check out the book. I'm being totally serious. Because I started early, which I thought I had everything in front of me, I didn't. Teleprompter turned off. I printed out the doctor's book and highlighted all the notes I had and quotes I had, and that's over there. You can't see over there. Don't look over there. But I think we did it. If you are a patron, the link is up to the champagne room. I kind of want to tell you what happened to me after I left Los Angeles. It was an interesting night, to say the least. And I want to talk to you guys. What do you guys have to say about what we talked about today? How do you feel about Dr. Stevens' theory? I had never heard anything like that. Let's talk about evolution. The first part of the book, it's broken down into like 3 parts. And the first part of the book is pretty much talking about this evolutionary mind and cavemen and this primitive mind, if you will, which really, especially by chapter 3, I was really like, okay, I'm really getting this now. And I believe it closes with the chapter on dementia, and Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, which was rough. Was I pulled over? I will tell you what happened in the champagne room. If you are a patron, the link is already up. If you would like to be a patron, guess what? If you've never tried before, there's a free trial for you. Patreon.com/Bitter Lake Presents. Wherever you are watching or listening to the show, there is a link in the description. You can join us for the insanity that is the champagne room. I will see you guys there shortly. Let's start everything early. I had a horrible night day. I didn't get home until almost noon. And I will tell you why. And there's nothing cool about it. Nothing cool happened. I don't have a cool red zone type story to tell you. Do not. But I want to tell you guys what happened because I think it's interesting. So I'll see you guys soon. We are